Jesus' resurrection is central to the Christian faith, to our faith. As Paul writes to the Corinthians, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." In light of this, it's interesting that Jesus chose to make his first resurrection appearance to a woman, as women were not deemed to be reliable witnesses at that time. But in fact, this only serves to add credence to the events, because if someone in the first century had wanted to invent a story about people seeing the resurrected Jesus, they would never have given such a key role to a woman, least of all to a woman of such dubious reputation as Mary Magdalene had been. I love this encounter between Jesus and Mary outside the tomb, and I love the fact that she is the first person to see him alive again. We don't know why at first she didn't recognise Jesus. John doesn't tell us that. Maybe it was her grief and tears that meant she didn't recognise him. Maybe it was because although he was the same, he was also clearly different. The disciples on the road to Emmaus didn't recognise him at first either. Or maybe it's just she was looking for his dead body and was not expecting to find him alive. What do you think? Why do you think she didn't recognise him at first? We also don't know why Jesus began by asking Mary why she was crying and who it was she was looking for, when clearly he already knew the answer to both these questions. But we do know the powerful effect Jesus calling Mary by name had. At once she turns towards him and cried out, "Rabboni," meaning teacher. You can imagine the look of tenderness and love which must have been on Jesus' face as he stood there in the garden looking at Mary, and how Mary's face must have lit up with joy as she cried out, "Rabboni." It reminds us of John 10, when Jesus described how the shepherd calls his own sheep by name. And the amazing thing is that Jesus knows our name and calls us by name too. Each of us, every one of us. But it's up to us how we respond when we hear him calling our name, in moments of crisis, moments of grief or joy, or just in the mundane moments of everyday life. Why not take a moment to try picturing Jesus standing in front of you, calling you by name, calling you. Imagine how he's looking at you. How do you respond? And clearly, Mary must not only have cried out to Jesus, but have reached out to hold on to him too, as he then says, "Do not hold on to me," or "Do not cling to me." Jesus then gives Mary, a woman, the important job of going to tell the disciples the amazing news that she has seen him. She has seen him alive. As Tom Wright puts it, Mary has become the apostle to the apostles. And significantly, Jesus now calls the disciples his brothers and tells Mary to tell them that he is ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Because of what Jesus has done on the cross, the disciples can now enter into that same intimate family relationship with God the Father that Jesus has. They are now brothers and sisters of Christ and children of God. A privilege which amazingly we can share today too. The other encounter I love in this chapter is that between Jesus and Thomas, who because of what happens here is often known as Doubting Thomas. For some reason, when Jesus first appeared to the disciples, Thomas was not with them, and he responded to their declaration that they had seen the Lord by saying, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now I know this has given Thomas a reputation as a skeptic and a doubter, but I love his honesty, his realness and his authenticity, and the fact that his doubts are recorded here. Perhaps this is because doubt is something I have so often struggled with myself over the years. But I can readily identify with Thomas as I can with the man in Mark's Gospel who said, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." But what I love even more than Thomas's honesty and doubts is Jesus' response to him, and Thomas's response in turn to Jesus. Rather than simply rebuking Thomas or leaving him with his doubts, Jesus appears again to the disciples when Thomas is with them and says to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Jesus meets Thomas where he is and helps him in his unbelief. And in response, Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." And as such, he, this doubting person, becomes the first person in the Gospel to address Jesus directly as God. And this is, of course, what John has been trying to get at right from the opening verses of the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was God. Jesus was and is God. And Jesus goes on to say to Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And I believe that Jesus will meet with those of us who doubt our faith at times today too, as he did with Thomas 2,000 years ago, when we really need him to. Yes, there are times when we need simply to press on, holding on to what the Bible tells us about Jesus, to what we know of him in our own lives. But there are times, and God knows when those times are, when we too need to see Jesus for ourselves in some way, to encourage us in our belief, or give us the nudge we need to take the next step on our own journey of discipleship. One such time occurred for me a few years ago now. I was entering a new, deeper stage of my faith and relationship with God and Jesus. Yet despite this, and a series of encounters I'd had with the Holy Spirit, the rational part of my brain was still questioning if it was all really true. And one evening when we were staying in the lakes, I went out on my own for a walk, just as it was going dark. And I stood alone, looking up at the mountains in all their grandeur, and asking God if he was really there or not. And as I stood there questioning God, I had an urge to begin trying to pray in tongues for the first time, which was not something I'd ever really even thought about doing before. The first few sounds felt slightly hesitant and awkward, but after that they just seemed to pour out of my mouth as a stream of consciousness, or rather subconsciousness, from somewhere deep inside my very being, in response to God, in response to his presence with me. And I took that as God's answer to my question, "Are you really there?" These are just a few of my thoughts. There's so much more I could say. What do you make of Jesus in this chapter? What stands out most to you?